The crisp November air clung to the old Victorian house as I unlocked the front door. My week of 7 consecutive night shifts had begun, and though I knew the work wasn't grueling, the thought of sleeping alone in the small staff bedroom always gave me a peculiar feeling of comfort and unease. The house had character, as they say. With its high ceilings, creaking floorboards, and ornate cornices, it seemed almost alive. It housed 3 residents, each with mild learning disabilities. My role was simple: helping with daily tasks like cooking, cleaning, and shopping, and ensuring everyone was settled for the night. I loved my job. The residents were a joy, each with their quirks and routines. For the sake of confidentiality, I'll change their names. There was Margaret, who loved cooking, Sam, who could spend hours rearranging his record collection, and Tony, who loved video games and has a mischievous side. Despite Tony's occasional antics, they all had kind hearts. The first 2 nights passed without incident. The quiet rhythm of the house at night was soothing. I'd fall asleep listening to the faint hum of the boiler or the occasional distant sound of a car passing on the street. But on the 3rd night, something felt different. It started with a faint creaking sound. At first, I dismissed it. It was an old house after all. The weather had turned colder, and I reasoned the wood was simply settling. But as I lay in bed in the cramped staff room, the creaks seemed purposeful, like footsteps moving across the floorboards. I sat up, straining my ears, but the sound stopped. Shaking my head, I told myself it must be my imagination, and drifted off to sleep. The next night, the sounds returned. This time, they seemed to come from all directions: creaks above, faint whispers in the walls, and the subtle shifting of the floor. My heart raced, but I forced myself to rationalize it. Old houses make noise. Maybe the neighbours next door were moving about. Still, a nagging feeling crept in, as though unseen eyes were watching me. I double-checked the locks before climbing into bed, pulling the covers tight around me. The night after was worse. The sounds grew louder and more distinct. Footsteps, doors creaking, and what I swore was a muffled voice. Lying in the dark, I felt an oppressive heaviness in the room, as though I wasn't alone. My imagination ran wild, and I fought the urge to call someone, but I didn't. It's nothing, I told myself. Just an old house and cold weather. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. By the 6th night, my nerves were frayed, and my lack of sleep made me less concerned about odd sounds. After ensuring the residents were in their room, ready for bed, and the house was secure, I climbed into bed, determined to put the strange sensations out of my mind. I fell asleep quickly, the weight of fatigue pulling me under. Sometime in the night, I woke abruptly. My heart pounded as I became aware of a presence in the room. Standing over me, leaning close, was a tall figure of a man. His face was shrouded in shadow, but I could feel his eyes fixed on me. Panic surged through me, and I let out a piercing scream, fumbling for the bedside lamp. In the split second it took for me to turn on the light, the man bolted. I heard his footsteps pounding down the stairs and the sound of the front door slamming shut. Trembling, I grabbed my phone and ran to check on the residents. Margaret, Sam, and Tony were awake, their frightened faces peeking out of their rooms. "Stay here," I told them, trying to steady my voice as I called the police. The officers arrived quickly. After ensuring the house was safe, they listened as I described the man. Tall, unkempt, with a thin build. One of the officers pointed out the attic hatch in the staff bedroom. "Have you checked up there recently?" he asked. I shook my head, my stomach twisting in dread. The thought that someone might have been hiding above me, watching me as I slept, was almost too much to bear. The officers investigated and found evidence that someone had been living in the attic. Discarded food wrappers, a blanket, and a few scattered belongings. My skin crawled. It didn't take long for the truth came to light. The intruder was a friend of Tony's, a man who was homeless and also had learning disabilities. Tony, in his typical mischievous manner, had lent his key to the man, who had let himself in and taken refuge in the attic. The faint sounds I'd been hearing all week suddenly made sense. He'd been moving around, lightly watching me through the attic hatch. The realization that he had been so close so often sent shivers down my spine. How many nights had he stood over me, unseen while I slept? The thought made me nauseous. The man was arrested, but I couldn't bring myself to press charges. He wasn't malicious, just desperate and without a home. Still, the incident left me deeply shaken. I took a few weeks off work, unable to face another night in that house. When I returned, I made it clear I wouldn't work night shifts again. Even now, I sometimes wake abruptly, heart racing, expecting to see a shadowy figure leaning over me. The old Victorian house has since been fitted with better locks and security cameras, but I know I'll never forget the chilling sense of being watched in the dark. It's a memory that stays with me, a ghost of fear that flickers just at the edge of the light. For 20 years I had worked in care attending to individuals with learning disabilities. I loved my job. It wasn't always easy, but it was fulfilling. The residents, all 25 of them, were like an extended family to me. Some required more assistance than others, and a few were independent enough to take the bus to town or attend day services on their own. Every day was different, and every day I left work feeling like I had made a difference. I never imagined I'd feel unsafe in the place I had dedicated so much of my life to. It all began after Mr. Harper, one of our elderly residents, passed away. His room stood vacant for about a month before we welcomed a new resident, Richard. He was a large man with broad shoulders, a head of thinning hair and a perpetual vacant look in his eyes. Richard was mute, which wasn't unusual for some of our residents, but there was something about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. He often stood in the corner, staring at staff with an intense expression as though he were deep in thought, but he rarely moved or responded to interaction. At first I dismissed the unease. I had cared for hundreds of residents over the years, each with unique quirks and behaviours. Richard wasn't any different, or so I thought. One day I was helping clean Richard's room while he sat silently in a chair watching me. His eyes didn't waver, his face blank, yet intense. Something about his stare sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to ignore it, chatting about the weather and other mundane topics as I tidied up. He didn't respond, just kept staring. I told myself I was overreacting. I was used to dealing with challenging behaviours, this was no different. But for the first time in my career I felt uneasy around a resident. A few nights later, during a late shift, I realised my car keys were missing from the staff room. It was unusual. Our staff were meticulous about keeping personal belongings safe. Assuming I might have left them in my car, I stepped outside into the cold night. There in the dimly lit car park, I saw someone sitting in the driver's seat of my car. Panic gripped me. As I approached, I realised it was Richard. He was staring at me, his vacant expression unchanged. "Richard," I called out, keeping my voice calm despite the anxiety bubbling within me. "What are you doing out here? It's cold. Come back inside." He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stared. I waved over another staff member for help, and after several tense minutes, Richard finally got out of the car and silently walked back to his room. 2 weeks passed without incident, and I began to relax, thinking the odd event was just a one-off. But during another shift, Richard began following me around. Wherever I went, he was there, standing a few feet behind, his unblinking eyes fixed on me. Even in the break room, he lingered just outside the door. I felt suffocated by his presence. My colleagues noticed too, offering to step in, but Richard always seemed to find his way back to me. When I left for a few days off, I hoped the time away would ease my nerves. One night during my time off, I heard faint sounds outside my front door. Living alone, I was cautious, so I peeked through the window. My breath caught in my throat. Richard was there, standing motionless on my front step, staring at my door. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone and called the care home. They sent staff to retrieve him, and I called the police as well. He was escorted back without incident, but my sense of safety was shattered. How had he found my home? I lived a 15 to 20-minute walk away, and I always drove to work. Had he followed me one day without my noticing? I barely slept that night. The image of his vacant stare burned into my mind. 2 nights later, I awoke at 3 a.m. to a loud thud at my front door. My chest tightened and a cold wave of dread washed over me. I crept to my bedroom window and peered out. Richard was there again, standing in the shadows of my porch, staring up at my window. His eyes met mine, vacant but unmoving. My hands shook as I called the police. I whispered into the phone, afraid he might hear me even though he hadn't moved an inch. The operator assured me help was on the way, but the minutes felt like hours. I stayed on the line, watching as Richard remained perfectly still, illuminated only by the faint glow of a nearby streetlight. When the police arrived, Richard didn't resist. He went with them willingly, as though he was waiting for them to come. The officers told me they would take him back to the care home and ensure he stayed there. The next morning, I called my manager and explained everything. They were shocked and sympathetic, promising to investigate how Richard managed to leave the care home unnoticed. But their reassurances did little to soothe my fear. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even during the day. Every noise outside made me jump. I avoided work for a week, unsure if I could face Richard or the care home again. The police spoke to Richard, but his muteness made communication nearly impossible. They discovered he had been sneaking out at night, wandering the streets, but they couldn't explain how he had found my home or why he was targeting me. They also found he had a little digital camera in his room, and he had been taking photos of me during work, along with a few other members of staff. Perhaps it was fixation, something we occasionally saw in residence, but the lack of answers left me feeling helpless. Eventually, Richard was moved to a more secure facility, one better equipped to manage his needs. I returned to work, but the experience left a scar. For the first time in 2 decades, I felt vulnerable in the job I loved. Even now, I sometimes think of Richard stood on my porch, or his vacant eyes staring through my window. I've come to understand that he likely didn't mean harm, that his fixation was a product of his condition, but the fear I felt in those moments was real and overwhelming. I still work in care, still find joy in helping others. But Richard taught me a lesson I never expected, that even in a profession built on compassion, boundaries must be maintained, and vigilance is sometimes necessary to protect yourself. Alright guys, if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.